today what I want to do is we're going to start on the creeds. And what we're going to do is we're going to go backwards from the last creed that was developed of the three main creeds. That's the Athanasian Creed. Then we're going to go to the Nicene Creed. And we're going to go to the first creed, and that's the Apostles' Creed. That's the one we always cite. So there's a backdrop to all of it, right? To not the Apostles' Creed, it doesn't fall into this backdrop, but to the Athanasian and the Nicene Creed, there's a backdrop, and that's the First Council of Nicaea. We've all heard of this, right? We hear of it in, Dan Brown. We hear of it, and we get all this misinformation is out there about what happened at the First Council of Nicaea. I know that it's crazy that there would be misinformation, right? So, bit of misinformation number one. It did not happen right after Constantine became a Christian. Constantine wasn't a Christian at this point, right? Constantine,
at that time, though, right?
maybe it depends on dating,
And who you talk to, right?
Yeah. It was actually had a president, and that president was not the Pope. It wasn't the Pope, right? The president was Hosius of Corduba. This is part of Hispania, what we would now call Spain. Right? There were 318 in attendance. Some people cite as few as 250, some as many as 318. Only 5 of them would be from the Western Church, so including the president. So that means there's 4 others. And they talked about a variety of topics, right? It wasn't just, the canon of the Bible, which really wasn't even discussed at the Council of Nicaea, right? So the books of the Bible, the canon, what we call the canon of the New Testament, not even talked about at the Council of Nicaea. Not even close. So here's what they talked about. Arianism. And we'll touch on what they talked about on each of these things. Arianism, the nature of Jesus, celebration of the Passover and Easter, ordination of eunuchs, prohibition of kneeling on Sundays and from Easter to Pentecost, the validity of baptism by heretics, what to do with Christians who had lapsed, and then they threw in some other matters. And we'll kind of talk into what others matters were. And then these things that came out of it, right? There was one letter that came out from the church to all the churches, or from this gathering to all the churches, saying, this is what we will believe, right? And included in that was the Nicene Creed, as well as they put 20 canons or teachings, 20 teaching points or 20 discussion points, right? So it was kind of the first effort to gain some kind of consensus amongst the people, amongst the leadership of the churches. This is what we will teach. Right? If you teach outside of this, you're not doing the right things, right? So the main thing that they talked about, though, was this: who is Jesus? Is Jesus merely a man? Is he merely God? Is he both God and man? Right? And, that's how we'll get into one of the bishops there, Athanasius. Athanasius was there. He wrote the Athanasian Creed. It's actually called the Proto-Athanasian Creed because it was based off of his teachings, but it was kind of after his lifetime. And then we'll talk about the Nicene Creed and what happened. But this would be the first uniform Christian doctrine. Everybody agreed on it. And that was the Nicene Creed. So it's called oikomene is the word for it, right? It was an ecumenical council. Now, we think of ecumenical council and we're like, wow, that sounds like a really dirty word, right? But ecumenical is not a dirty word. It means the same thing that Catholic means, right? One gathered, one universal council. The word literally means worldwide, right? And yeah, the first use of it comes from Eusebius's The Life of Constantine. which he wrote in 338, which states that he convoked an ecumenical council, or a synod, right? We would recognize the word synod, especially, if we've read any kind of church history. When they gather all the church together, that's a synod. They've got a synod, which is just a gathering of teachers, right? So your bishops, your deacons, things like that. So they would send out invitations. They invited 1,800 bishops, and each bishop was allowed to bring people with him, right? So that's how we end up. So there's somewhere around 318 showed up, and we have this in the writing of several people. So Constantine the Great, he summoned the bishops of the Christian church to Nicaea to address divisions, right? We've talked a lot about division, right? When we're going through 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Clement's letters, there's been division in the church. Right? The church keeps splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting, and we would call those things denominations, right? Denominator is the number you divide by in a division problem. So a denomination is a division of the church. So some churches call themselves Baptist or Presbyterian or Pentecostal or this or that. So I would almost state that I'm not a non-denominational, because that's becoming a denomination in and of itself. I would almost say that I'm anti-denominational. I'm anti-divisions in the church, right? I think that we can take these secondary matters, which is what a lot of these divisions are based on, right? And we can throw them on the back burner. And that's what the Nicene Council was there to do. They wanted to take secondary matters and make them secondary matters and focus on the primary things, right? Who is God? Who is Jesus? What did Jesus have to say? What was he telling us? How was it all working?
The basics.
Yeah, this is the basic stuff, right? That's why I focus so much on the Apostles' Creed. That's why I focus on these early creeds, because they give us this basic formula of what does a Christian have to believe, right? I don't think it's necessary that we discuss, all right, thou shalt read this version of the Bible. I don't think that works. That to me is just the silliness. I don't speak Elizabethan English. It's just not my thing. It's not my gig, right? I didn't study Shakespeare, right? I don't speak that English, right? So I would need a more updated English so that it's in my vernacular, right? That common vernacular, also known as koine, if we were speaking Greek. That's common Greek, right? So what they sought to do is give one overarching common set of beliefs in the church. That's all they were setting out to do, right? So enter in this guy named Arius, right? Arius is coming in and he's like, Jesus isn't God, right? So, and that is the entirety of the background for why they had to come together. Now, Constantine had invited all 1,800 bishops of the Christian church. There were 1,800 bishops, right? You had your initial schism, right, which was the Greek Orthodox and the Catholic, right? That had happened. So you had your Eastern and your Western, right? That was 1,000 from the Eastern Church, right, the Orthodox, and 800 from the Western Church, or the Catholic Church, right? But a smaller number attended. Eusebius said it was over 250. Athanasius counted 318. And then the numbers vary, but the number that we have a whole lot of is 318. And we get that Evagrius, Hilary of Poitiers, Jerome, Dionysius, Exiguus, and Rufinus all give us 318. So if we want to settle with the most probable number, we'll settle at 318. But it was somewhere around 300. That's what we really need to know out of that.
300, give or take a few, right?
300, give or take, 20, whatever, right? the number really doesn't matter. What matters is the list, right? So they listed all 318, these people did. Or the 250, or the 270, or the 280, right?
Whatever it was.
Right. So in the list of 250, in the list of 270, we do not have Nicholas of Myra. In the list of 280, in the list of 318, we do have Nicholas of Myra. He's an important figure in church history. Yes, Sam?
You're saying that he invited 1,800 and only 300 came?
Yes. He invited 1,800 and only 300 came. Now, keep in mind that what else are these guys doing? A lot of them are also the pastor at the church. You can't just leave the pulpit free and clear, right? May not have had deacons who were trained up enough to be able to teach.
And traveling wasn't it exactly?
Yeah. And traveling wasn't all that easy, right? So
by foot.
So delegates would come from every region. There was delegates from Britain. So when we say, traveling wasn't easy, you're right, but there were guys from Britain there. They did see it important, right? And when you look at the fact that each one had permission to bring 2 priests and 3 deacons, the total number, if you look at the 318 plus their 2 priests and 3 deacons, that's 5 more per, we're looking at over 1,800 people showing up. Imagine the chaos that would have ensued if 6 times that showed up. So, we're ending up with whole bunches. 22 from Colais in Syria, 19 from Palestine, 10 from Phoenicia, 6 from Arabia, some from Assyria, Mesopotamia, Persia. But they hadn't really made a distinction between the bishops and the presbyters.
Merchandiser enjoyed that week, though.
Yeah. So the real thing is there was an agenda to it all, right? They were there to talk about Arianism and this bad teaching, right? They wanted to make sure they came out with one clear teaching, right? So we see that a guy named Athanasius, he was a deacon. He was the companion of Bishop Alexander of Alexandria. There's a creative name. He was among his assistants. He spent most of his life battling against Arianism. Right? Now, when we say Arianism, people are like, you mean like the Nazis? No, this is a different kind of Arianism. There's no Y's in it, right? Arianism is named for Arius. So Arius had his own supporters. He had Secundus, Ptolemy, Thinus of Marmarica, Zephyrus, Dathes, and they were all from Libyan Pentapolis. Right? He had some other supporters, but Constantine, he makes this. So Eusebius says, resplendent in purple and gold, Constantine made a ceremonial entrance at the opening of the council in early June, but respectfully seated the bishops ahead of himself. Constantine himself proceeded through the midst of the assembly like some heavenly messenger of God, clothed in raiment which glittered as it were the rays of light, reflecting the glowing radiance of a purple robe, and adorned with brilliant splendor of gold and precious stones. Right? He organized the council. He was president of the council, but he kept his mouth shut throughout the council. So when people say that Constantine ran it, once again, they're making this completely false, I would almost say fallacious, but it's not fallacious. He was there. They're making a false claim. It's historically inaccurate. Constantine actually said very little. All right? So, and what they were really there to discuss and what they had been discussing.
This was before he said, okay, Christianity is the only.
He never actually said Christianity is the only, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but he never actually said Christianity is the only permitted religion.
Ah.
So, at this point, Christianity had been, we'll call it legal for 14 years, though we do see that in 313, up to 313, they were allowed to be persecuted. So really only 12 years that they were not permitted to be persecuted for being Christians. And that wasn't even at the doing of Constantine. They made it legal in 311. They made it against the law to persecute Christians in 313. Yes, Ross?
Isn't Constantine that guy who made it illegal not to be a Christian?
We'll get into that. That's kind of what Tom just asked. It's she asked the same thing you did.
Oh.
So
So he didn't hear me.
no. That's kind of vice versa of what you're used to. So the first thing that they wanted to talk about was the Arian question, right? The Arian question regarded the relationship between God the Father and God the Son, not only incarnate but also in nature before the creation of the world. So are the Father and the Son one in divine purpose only, or also one in being? Then they also want to discuss the date of the celebration of Passover or Easter, right? Now the Christian bishops, and I think I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the Christian bishops have felt that the Jewish leadership were miscalculating the 14th of Nisan. But we'll talk about that. They want to talk about the Meletian schism, right? This separation of the church. They want to talk about church discipline and how to do it. Then they want to talk about how to reconcile the lapsed, those who had lapsed in their faith. They established public norms for public repentance and penance, and readmission to the church of heretics and schismatics, right? Including issues of reordination and rebaptism and or rebaptism were to be required, right? When would it be required for you to be reordained or rebaptized? Then liturgical practice, including what deacons were to do, and the practice of standing at prayer during the liturgy or during church, right? So keep in mind, first century church, a lot different from 21st century church, right? First century church, second century church, third century church. The people in the audience would stand, right? Unless it was time to pray, at which point they would kneel. This is where the Catholic Church gets the kneel, stand, sit, all that, right? So they would kneel during time of prayer, but they would stand otherwise. The bishop or the priest would stay seated or would kneel during times of prayer. They would teach seated. So it would be vice versa of what we see here now. Y'all would be standing and I'd get to sit down. All right, so...
Well, that was how Jesus was too.
Right, so the council was opened on the 20th of May. So what we're 2 weeks from day one of the Nicene Council. That's kind of cool, right? From the anniversary of, I should say. And then Constantine, he would arrive nearly a month later on the 14th of June. So he convened it, but was he even present for all of it? No. Right? So we've got this faulty idea of the involvement of him. So 22 of the bishops came as supporters of Arius, but when they started getting into what Arius was actually saying, they were like, whoa, 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 whoa. Yeah, I can't be in that, right? Eusebius of Caesarea, he called to mind the baptismal creed of his own diocese at Caesarea at Palestine as a form of reconciliation. And the Orthodox bishops, right? So after this whole discussion, the Orthodox bishops won approval of every one of their proposals regarding the creed, right? So they finally, at the end, everybody's like, yay, nay, right? Every one of the original creed that were brought by the 22 bishops was accepted, right? So, and it was declared as orthodoxy. Now, the creed was promulgated on the 19th of June in 325. The Nicene Creed has stood in the church since the 19th of June in 325.
Wow.
And
Friday?
yet people want to not recite creeds. They say the creeds are unnecessary in our church today. I would beg to differ because, yeah, it lost. The fight against it lost on the 19th of June in 325. 1,700 years worth of, we're going to believe the exact same things as a church. And now people kick against it. Right? So, the Arian controversy, right? So, it is really about the Trinity. That's what the Arian controversy was about. It's about the Trinity. Can I worship Jesus Christ as God? Is Jesus Christ God? Right? They didn't even get into the Holy Spirit a whole lot. Their first discussion was, is Jesus God? That's what they cared about. And, as I said, 5 days after the appearance of Constantine, they voted that indeed he would be God. Now, this debate hinged on the difference between being born or created, right, and being begotten. Right? Is he created of God? Is he the first created of God, or is he the first begotten of God? And what's the difference between the two? They were debating this in 325. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about when we go through the Athanasian Creed, right? Is what's the difference between being born and being begotten, right? And we'll probably really get into that next week, right? So, the word that they used in this is homoousios. Homoousios, right? Which was one of the groups of people there, right? Now, homoousios means homo, like being substance, ousios, together, of one, right? One substance. Sorry, it's homo, one, or like, yeah, one or like. Ousios, substance, one substance. One with the Father. God-man. Right? So, Arius argued for the supremacy of God, the Father, and maintained that the Son of God was created as an act of the Father's will. This remind you of any groups you've heard of? Maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses? They are an Arian group. They believe that, the council was wrong. They actually state that the Trinity came out of the council. But we see the Trinity in the writings nearly 100 years before the council. So it definitely didn't come from the council. We see Jesus called God in about 140 and before. In the writings of Justin Martyr, he clearly calls Jesus God. So we know that it goes that far back. And when we're told to worship Jesus not just throughout the Bible, but even in the writings of Clement, the writings of Ignatius, right? Those are disciples of disciples. Clement and Ignatius are disciples of Peter/Paul, right? Clement, he's mentioned in Philippians 4, right? And then Ignatius and Polycarp, they were co-disciples of John, kind of important guy, since he was an apostle of Jesus and wrote a couple books, right? So, but, they would say he is the truest sense of Son. He must have come after the Father. Therefore, the time obviously was when he was not, and hence he was a finite being. That's what the Arians said about Jesus, right? And they appealed to scriptures such as John 14:28, that the Father is greater than I, and Colossians 1:15, which it calls Jesus the firstborn of all creation. We understand that means that he is preeminent, that he is above all, and when Jesus says the Father is greater than I, he's in the flesh on earth. So we've really got to look at those in context, and we'll do a lot of that when we're going through the Athanasian Creed. So the arguments against Arius, right? He was, depicted as defeated by the council, right? The opposing view stemmed from the idea that the Son is itself in the nature of the Father, which is eternal. Thus the Father was always Father, and both Father and Son always existed together, eternally, co-equally, and consubstantially, meaning of the same substance, right? The Contra-Arian argument thus stated that the Logos, the Word, was eternally begotten, therefore with no beginning, right? John 1, right, it talks about in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, He was with God in the beginning. So if He was there in the beginning, then could He have began to exist, is what they're basically saying.
Through him was all things made.
Yeah. Through Him all things were made that have been made. Did Jesus make Himself? He would have to in the Arian view, right? So they did end up coming up with that Jesus is light from light and true God from true God, parts of the Nicene Creed. View that there was once when He was not, right? That's an Arian writing, was rejected to maintain the co-eternity of the Son with the Father. The view that He was mutable or subject to change was rejected to maintain that the Father, just like the Son, was beyond any form of weakness or corruptibility, right? And Hosius of Cordova, one of the Homoousians, right, those who call Jesus God-man, right, of the same substance as God, yet man, right? He kind of helped to bring everybody to the consensus of this look. And even in spite of his sympathy for Arius, Eusebius of Caesarea adhered to the decisions of the council, accepting the entire creed. So he was like, all right, I kind of get down with you, Arius. You know, we can be okay here. And then when it all boiled over, when everything came to the end, he said, never mind, I'll take creed for one. Yeah, one for the creed, thanks. Only two, three if you count Arius, but only two voted with Arius, and that was Theonas of Marmarica in Libya and Secundus of Ptolemy. Right, Maris of Chalcedon, who initially supported Arianism, agreed to the whole creed. Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theogenes of Nice also agreed, except for certain statements. Right, so they wanted to take a couple of statements out. But most, like out of the 318, we've got 4 names who voted in dissent. Well, 3 who voted in dissent of all, and 2 who voted in dissent to part of the creed. And it was amended at the First Council of Constantinople in 381. So then they wanted to discuss Easter. Easter's.
Oh, that had been a conversation.
So here's what they were discussing, right? Contemporary Jews, they believed that contemporary Jews were identifying the wrong lunar month as the month of Nisan, right? Choosing a month whose 14th day fell before the spring equinox, right? They thought they were just, choosing it, right? So some Christians had set Easter to a Sunday in the lunar month of Nisan. To determine which lunar month was to be determined, they would rely on the Jewish community, right? And then some of them were like, yeah, they're talking about the wrong month here, man. Now, the controversy between those who argued for independent computations and those who argued for continued reliance, it was resolved by the council, but it was fairly evenly split between the two. And they did largely, they still follow the Passover. They did not state that Easter must never coincide with the 14th day of Nisan, right? They endorsed the move to independent computations, and it is always around the 14th day of Nisan, and the Julian Easter always follows the Hebrew 14th of Nisan. So whenever Passover is, that next Sunday, guess what that is? Easter Sunday. So you want to know why it shifts a little bit from year to year? Easter, or Passover, right? Lunar calendar is 28 days. It shifts to match that lunar calendar every single year. So it's a matter of style points.
Where the moon was.
Yeah, where's the moon falling, right? So then there was the Meletian Schism, right? Meletian Schism. The suppression of the Meletian Schism as an early breakaway sect was another important matter that came before them. Meletius it was decided should remain in his own city of Lycopolis in Egypt, but without exercising authority or the power to ordain new clergy. It's forbidden to go into the environs of the town or to enter another diocese for the purpose of obtaining its subjects. Right? He did retain his episcopal title. Right? They said you can be a bishop still. You can't ordain new people. You can't go outside of your city to teach. Right? They didn't feel that it was worth creating a bigger division on secondary matters. They felt that he was wrong, but they weren't prepared to deem him as a complete and total heretic. Right? And then they put together 20 new church laws. Right? The first prohibited the castration of clergy, self-castration of clergy. Right? Because some would say, I got to be like Paul and not, not partake in the things. So they would.
So that's where they came.
They would emasculate themselves, right? And this is where we get the priests
being,
must be unmarried and celibate.
and that has caused problems.
And well, that's not what has caused problems. To me, the problem is caused that that's not what's directed anywhere in the Bible. Now, the next one, there's got to be a minimum term for catechumens, right? These people have to not just claim to be of the faith, but have to stay within the faith for X amount of years or X amount of time. And that was before they could be baptized. That's to make sure that they understand the faith in which they're coming into. So, yeah, you weren't to meet alone with younger women if you were a priest.
Self-explanatory.
Yeah, that should be self-explanatory. We look at, the moral failings of pastors in the 21st century, pastors, preachers, teachers in the 21st century, and we can kind of understand that, right? And we see, people like Mike Pence. He refused to meet alone with a woman who was not his wife. And he got roasted for that.
Boy, did he get blasted for that.
So, yet then, what were we talking about 6 months later after that? Oh, well, this person's accused of sexual assault. This person's accused of sexual assault. This person's accused of sexual misconduct, right? All this stuff starts going down with other people, and he's going, see, now that's why I do that. Me personally, I will not ever meet individually with a woman, not my wife, alone. It will not happen. Period. Billy Graham was the same way. He would never meet alone with a woman who was not Ruth Bell Graham, and he would also never be alone with the money of the church, of the ministry. Period. Those were two things he would never do. He said nothing will bring down a ministry quicker than a scandal, and the two biggest scandals are sex and money. So, I likewise will refuse to do those things. Then there was the discussion of the ordination of a bishop in the presence of at least 3 bishops, and confirmation by the big bishop. Right? There would be 2 provincial synods to be held annually. So if you were in Alexandria, that whole group, right? So the Synod of Hippo, when Augustine was a bishop, there was one there, right? So the bishops would bring all their priests together, and they would say, hey guys, we need to do blah, 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 right? So they gave jurisdiction of ancient customs over large regions to the bishops of Alexandria, Rome, and Antioch. So 3 central areas of bishops, and they ruled. So, like the Bishop of Alexandria would have all of the African bishops under him. The Bishop of Rome would have all the European bishops under him. And the Bishop at Antioch would have all of the Asian bishops under him. Note what city is missing from that. Anybody? Anybody? How about Nicaea? Nicaea is missing. They didn't consider it to be that important of a city. That centralized of a city. Right? They did give honorary rights of the See of Jerusalem. Right? The bishop in Jerusalem had special rights, we'll call them, because Israel or Jerusalem was kind of a big deal. Prohibition of usury among clergy, right? So they couldn't just take money out of the coffer whenever they wanted. Right? There was more, right? But on the 25th of July, they concluded and they celebrated the emperor's 20th anniversary. Constantine informed the audience how averse he was to dogmatic controversy, wanted the church to live in harmony and peace. And in a circular letter, he announced the accomplished unity of peace by the whole church in the date of the celebration of Christian Passover, right? So we were all going to worship Easter together. So that year, as they declared Easter to have been March 25th, right, or the Sunday after the 14th day of Nisan, they celebrated. This was the first time they really looked at the date of Christmas. People, they believed, now, mind you, they believed, it didn't make it true, that, and it was more of a, old wives' tale at that point, right? They believed that somebody died on the same day that they were conceived. They were conceived.
Like Shakespeare.
Yeah. Right? So they believed that they would die on the same day they were conceived. So if Jesus died, they would die on the same day they were conceived. Yes. Meaning, if March 25th is the date of death of Jesus, what happens 9 months after that?
He was born.
His birth. What's 325 plus 9 months? December 25th. That's where Christmas comes from. Not pulled from any other god's birthday. So,
But then they misconstrued themselves because now they make Easter different day
right.
every
Well,
year.
they just made it based on the date of Easter
so
that
they
year.
Kind of,
Well,
I would say,
they were just trying to set a date for the festival of. That's all they did. They just set a date for the festival of
So is it
Christmas.
wrong to celebrate?
I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's wrong. I don't think it's pagan worship. I don't think it's worshiping a false idol. It's not set up on Sol Invictus, which was December 21st. It's not set up on any of that garbage, right? It is legitimately set up on the false belief that somebody was born or somebody died on the same day they were conceived. That's it. That's all it's based on.
So how did it go from that to different date every year?
What, Easter? Easter was always going to be different days of the year, right? So they just
the original first day
yeah,
of Easter.
they just wanted the day that Christmas was. Yeah, they just wanted to put a day down for a festival, for a Christmas festival. So Christmas started being celebrated in the church in 325. They really didn't celebrate the birth of Jesus up to that point. So what was Constantine's role in all of this? Dude was present for less than a month. right? 3 months worth of meeting, he's present for less than a month of it.
Right.
Makes it hard for him to be overly involved.
Right.
They had formed the entire Nicene Creed, minus the voting portion, before he even shows up.
He
Right?
just came and signed the contract.
Did he set forth the biblical canon? No. We saw they didn't even discuss the biblical canon at the Council of Nicaea. It wasn't a discussion. Now, did Constantine commission Bibles to be put in the churches? Yes. Whose hands did he put that in? The ecumenical councils. Right? In 331, he bought 50 Bibles. Just because he put 50 Bibles in a church doesn't make him responsible for the contents of the Bible. Right? Any more than the Congress putting Bibles in every schoolhouse in America responsible for the content of the Bibles. But they did. They put them in every schoolhouse. Doesn't that mean that they oversaw what was in them? No.
Now they took them out of
Their main thing that they wanted to talk about, the main source of the idea that the canon was created at the Council of Nicaea comes from Voltaire. Huh? Voltaire is much later. We have a whole lot of writings between the Council of Nicaea and Voltaire, all stating nothing about the canon of Scripture being formed at the Council of Nicaea. Yeah. Who popularized the story that the canon was determined by placing all of the competing books on an altar during the Council of Nicaea and keeping ones that did not fall off. That is a fictitious story. It's fake. Right? It's just fake, right? So the one, something else that they didn't actually fully discuss, the Trinity. They didn't fully discuss the Trinity. They just talked about who God the Father is and who God the Son is, right? The Trinity would be, completely discussed later, right? By guys like, it had already been written of by guys like Origen and Tertullian, right, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, right? But now we're in the 4th century, and it was already established what the Trinity was.
So would that be the reason why the word Trinity is not mentioned in the Bible?
The word Trinity doesn't show up anywhere in Tertullian,
Right. So,
which is, around 180 to 200.
so that would be...
So it's not in the Bible, yes, I concur. But it's,
I have one question.
Sure.
Why is the Trinity essential to Christianity proper?
Because we have to understand who God is, right? The whole Godhead portion, right? It's understanding that, one God, 3 persons, right? Neither dividing the person nor right? All of that, right? Which we're going to get into when we really break down the Athanasian Creed. We're going to see, why is this so important, right? Why is it important that we understand who God is?
Yeah.
The whole of the Godhead.
This is why I have this ongoing thing with Mormons, and other people who are not Trinitarian, because that's the one thing I do profess. Because otherwise I don't feel as though, personally, like what I'm writing right now, it has to do with my understanding of a soul.
Right.
Like ultimately, I don't feel as though there's a soul without a Trinity. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, which is really what we're going to start getting into when we get into this Athanasian Creed, because it does kind of bring these elements into it. And,
You're going to go over that, right?
yeah, absolutely. The Athanasian Creed is what we're going to start with next, because it's the last of the 3 creeds. Then we're going to go into the Nicene Creed, and then we're going to go all the way back to the Apostles' Creed. And we'll see why, while it doesn't mention everything that we're going to talk about within the confines of what is Christianity, it does talk about all these things that we believe within the confines of Christianity. right? Well, it's not explicit; it's kind of implicit in the way that it's formed and things of that nature.
But just one last statement.
Sure.
That's how I've come to understand your position on why you don't accept the Jews and the Muslims and other people who are monotheistic but don't adhere to Jesus in the same way.
Right. I believe that's the big difference, right? Is who is God, right? That's the difference between us and the Muslims. The Muslims believe that Jesus didn't even die. That's Surah 4, 157 and 158 for those keeping score at home, right? It says that Jesus, the son of Mary, Isa, son of Miriam, did not even die. He would not perish on the cross. That's what it says. That's Surah 157 and 158. In Surah 4, parts 157 and 158, right? It's very clear that Jesus didn't die on the cross. That somebody else did. Right? Well, he was the great prophet, right? And that's the biggest difference between Christianity and other monotheistic religions is who is God really? Who's God proper? Right? Like Rick was talking about, right? It's this difference between, God and the monotheistic God of Islam and Judaism and Christianity, right? The monotheistic God is different in each of them, right? And in Islam, his name is Allah. You will only refer to him as Allah. And to refer to him as anything else is to shirk. Is that what they call it? I think it's called shirk. Yeah. I think it's called shirk. I'm not positive on that. I'll look that one up, right? In Judaism, it's a name that you don't say.
Hashem.
Yeah.
Which just means the name.
Yeah. It's Hashem, the name, right? Or YHWH. When they're writing it in English, they write G-D. They don't even write God, right? Because they feel as though it's inappropriate to talk about him and give his name, right? Which is why Jesus saying I am, which is a refiguration of the word Hayah, which is I am, right? Which is the name that God gives for himself, which is where we get Yahweh, right? It's the big difference.
Blasphemy to the Jews.
Right. This is why it's blasphemy to the Jews. And Jesus is truly saying, I'm God.
It's blasphemy because he said his name?
Because he said that he is him. Right. When he says, I am, Jesus is saying, I'm God. And they understood that. We don't in today's culture because we're like, it's not really what he's saying there. Yeah, it is. It really is. Like, authentically.
That's why they yelled out, you heard the blasphemy.
Yeah, you've heard the blasphemy for yourself, right?
It's like saying I'm God when you want to raise up stones and kill me.
So
how would the Jews today, how would they talk to you about God? What would they call him?
Hashem, the name.
That just means
The name. Yeah. So note who we haven't talked about. The Pope.
Who they thought was
What
Peter.
did the Pope have to do with the Council of Nicaea? The answer to that is nothing.
Nothing. He wasn't even there.
He was there for portions. He had nothing to do. He was not involved in the way that we would anticipate if we believe this whole the Pope is the sole authority. He was not involved in that way.
So there was
Period.
a pope during that time
Oh, yeah.
period, but he was more like a president. He wasn't.
Well, he wasn't even the president at this thing. The president was what was his name? Hosius of Corduba, right, which is in Hispania. So the Pope really had nothing to do with it. He wasn't seen as this grand figure that we put today. And if you look at, even go a little later, go 100 years later, the writings of Augustine to Zosimus, he's not writing as if to some, archetype Godhead figure. which we would almost paint the Pope as, but just to another guy who happened to be the one who says, oh yeah, you, Bishop, yeah, you're going to go over here because they need help in your field of expertise. That's all he really did. He wasn't some
Well, in essence,
otherworldly god.
that was before the Roman Empire truly fell.
Right.
I thought it was after the Roman Empire fell, then the Pope became basically the new Caesar.
Yeah.
And established all the kingdoms and was able to
Through Byzantine Empire.
in the world.
Yeah.
So is this Big C Catholic? I'm confused.
Yes. Big C Catholic.
That all these people getting together.
They're little C Catholic. There is no, so you got to remember that they are little C Catholic because they've got the Eastern Church and the Western Church both represented, right? So you've got all three main, groups of Christians. You've got the European Christians out of Rome. You've got the African Christians out of Alexandria, and you've got the Asian Christians out of Antioch, right? You've got them all together. You've got the discussion of the Milesians, right, which was that first big schism, right? You've got all these discussions taking place. It's a little C Catholic because it involves not just the Catholic Church, right, which would become even more of a big C Catholic in the following century, right, as Rome falls and the emperor kind of, the Pope and emperor kind of become melded into one unit. So we see all these things that we think happened at the Council of Nicaea, right? Dan Brown makes them famous that, hey, they voted to exclude this book at the Council of Nicaea. No, they didn't. They didn't even talk about it. They talked about Mary being the mother of Jesus. No, they didn't even talk about it. Talk about the divinity of Christ. They talked about what is this one creed going to look like that will go across the whole of the empire. They had, full denials by 3 people. They had partial denials by 2 people. So that leaves us 313 people who said, I accept the entirety of the creed. That's not just the Catholics, right? That's your believers in every one of the schisms. And why did they come together? Because Constantine was scared. He knew that a separation of the church would lead to the downfall of the empire. And once the church really truly did separate, and you had the Constantine church, right, the Orthodox church in Greece, you had the African church in Africa, you had the European church out of Rome, what happened? The empire kind of imploded on itself. So once that schism really truly happened, all 3 believed the same creed, but they said that we cannot reconcile on secondary matters. And now we have denominations or divisions in the church. Yes?
So the point in them getting together was to bring unity?
Yes. And it did create unity. Yes?
Until it didn't.
Okay, Rosalind, so let's break this down.
What's
What's the problem with denominations is the question.
Okay.
What's the problem with denominations? Okay, so why am I anti-denominational? It's what I would call myself if I were, forced to discuss it. I would say I'm anti-denominational. All right? So what is, in a division problem, what's the number you divide by called? On top, right, you have the what? Go, Sammy. The numerator is on top. What's the number on the bottom called? The denominator. The thing you divide by is called the denominator. So what do you call? So another word, right? So another word for a division in the church is called a denomination or a split. So every time we refer to this whole denomination thing, we are referring to a split in the body of Christ. That's against the teachings in Jude. That's against the teachings in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Titus, Philemon. If you look throughout the New Testament, Jesus and his disciples, all those who wrote, say a bad word about splitting the body of Christ.
Paul would really dig on that.
We cannot say, let's break apart the body of Christ. We have to learn how to reconcile these secondary problems. And that's what this whole series is going to be about, is how to reconcile the secondary problems and hold to the main thing. And that's what we see in the creeds, is what is the main thing. And why can I, why do I not break the church apart on a secondary matter, as long as we're all keeping the main thing the main thing? And that's why I feel that it's necessary to do this. So, all right, that ends Sunday school.
I dig it.